Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast, hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Okay, so welcome back. Today we're looking to explore the research structure at the School of Energy Resources, and our guest is Scott Quillinan, who leads all that research, and we'll meet him in a second. And we're going to focus in on a specific area within our research program, which is multi-disciplinary research around oil and gas in Wyoming. Wyoming is a top oil and gas producer in the U.S., and today the School of Energy Resources is leading a new effort to access a largely untapped oil and gas reserve known as the Mowry Project, and it's really important to our students, faculty, and to the state. So, welcome, Scott. Let's have you start by telling our listeners a little bit about your background and how you came to work at the School of Energy Resources, and then your role today.
Well, hi, Holly. Thanks for having me. I'm Scott Quillinan, Senior Director of Research for School of Energy Resources. So what's my background? I'm a geologist by training. I grew up in Wyoming, so I'm a Wyoming native. I came to the University of Wyoming, so I'm a Wyoming alumni. And I went to geology school here. After graduating with degrees in geology here at University of Wyoming, I went to work for the Geologic Survey. So I spent about 5 years working in various offices at the Geologic Survey, things around oil and gas, coal, groundwater. And then a position opened up at the School of Energy Resources. And at that point, I was in a point in my career where I was looking for the next step, looking for one of those really fancy oil and gas jobs down in Houston or one of those other places I kept hearing about. So I took a job at School of Energy Resources for just one short year so that I could really look for that next step in my career. And that was 10 years ago. So I'm still here. I'm still here because I love it here.
So what is your role today at the School of Energy Resources?
My role is Senior Director of Research. So I manage the research component for the school.
And it's a big component.
It is a big component.
Yeah. How is this team, your team, organized?
Okay, so as you said, it's a really large component of what we do. So let me just kind of describe a high level. So how we organize the research function at School of Energy Resources is into different centers of excellence. So we have centers of excellence that we house here at School of Energy Resources that we staff internally with our own staff. We're up to 38 researchers that staff those centers. And then we have several centers across campus that are led by our faculty. And those are kind of cross-cutting centers, not housed at School of Energy Resources, but they might be housed in the College of Engineering or in the Department of Atmospheric Science or in geology. Not everything we do in research is housed within those centers. One thing that School of Energy Resources does is it really acts as like a hub for energy research all across campus. So for example, every year, SER funds over 200 people across campus, faculty and students, to work on energy-related problems that can help energy challenges in the state of Wyoming.
Yeah, that's perfect. And one thing you always say that I think is really important is faculty have to have support to work on specific topics.
That's absolutely true.
So if they don't have that support, then it's really hard for them to make an impact in an area. So maybe part of what your team does and what the research function here does is identify critical issues for Wyoming and then support faculty to work on them.
Absolutely. Yep.
And then you have your own staff who work here and tackle big stuff too.
Right. And then we can also help faculty connect with industry partners or communities or outside stakeholders to help with that.
That's really important too. And how do we decide to take on a specific topic in our research program?
Well, we're mission-driven here at School of Energy Resources, so everything we do aligns with our mission, which is energy-driven economic development for Wyoming. And so our first check on if we take on a research project is it has to align with that mission. It has to have an impact in Wyoming. So that's step number one. Number two is we have to have expertise to work on that problem. So we'll do a lot of mapping across campus to understand where all the talent lies and really bring that talent into these problems. And then number three, we have to have funding to do it. So if we can't find funding through our funding that we have here at School of Energy Resources, a lot of times we'll help faculty or others identify federal funding that we can go after to work on those problems.
Perfect. And what, in your eyes, the centers of excellence are all really different from each other and they're focused on different topics. What makes one center or all of them successful?
So when we design a center of excellence, one, we have to identify that emerging challenge, aligns with our mission, get the expertise, you get the funding lined up. But the secret behind a center of excellence is to design it like it would be a joint venture in the private world. So you identify that problem, and the expertise you bring to it is just like bringing those partners together, and they're taking a risk. And so they come together, focus on one common problem, and then they're able to really go after that problem, go after funding to solve that problem, and really work together collaboratively on that problem. That becomes a center, and that becomes a center of excellence. And then it's a thing, and then it's a cohort, and then this group can move on to go look at new problems.
So today we're going to focus on there's so many different areas we could talk about in the research program. We're going to focus on one, which is the Mowry Project. And this was your brainchild. First of all, how did you come up with that idea for the Mowry Project?
Well, we've always known the Mowry Shale underlies most of geologic basins in Wyoming. We always have known that it holds oil and gas. We've known it's a source rock for a lot of our conventional reservoirs. The Mowry has always been a really complex reservoir. It's been one that it's deep, it's geochemically complex. There's some weird geomechanics that go on with it. And so it's been one of those plays that we've always known about, but there's been lower hanging fruit to go after first. And so that allowed us as a university and academics to really kind of focus on some of the fundamental problems with the Mowry Shale that can help spur development.
And I've noticed we're still pretty early in that project. The industry is interested. Okay, so I'm just assuming, by the way, that I am not the only person listening to you talk that is not a geologist. So when you say source rock, can you explain what that means?
Yes, I can. So when you have a petroleum system, you need a few things. One thing is you need what we call a source rock. So that's a really organic rich rock that was buried deep enough that got cooked that it turned those organics into oil and or gas. And so that rock, as it's cooked, it expels the oil and or gas, migrates out of the source rock and into a reservoir rock.
Is it going up?
It's going up, or it can go down.
Oh, it can go down too.
Yeah,
okay.
Or it can go down. So it's expelled out of that source rock into those reservoir rocks. And then the reservoir rocks are what we would call a conventional reservoir, and that's what we've been drilling for over 100 years in Wyoming. The source rocks are now, because of advances in technology, because some of those conventional reservoirs are starting to be depleted, now we can go back in and look in those unconventionals or those source rocks for oil and gas. And the Mowry Shale is one of those unconventional plays in Wyoming.
So even though it fed these other oil and gas basins that have been at least partially developed, there's still a lot of oil there and gas, maybe.
Most of it.
Most of it?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. But we have to use unconventional techniques to get at it.
Yes, you do. You're going to have to frack it. You're going to have to deal with much smaller porosities, much smaller permeabilities. So even though there's still a lot of oil and gas, their ultimate recovery might be much lower percentage than a conventional reservoir.
Okay. But what matters in a lot of ways is total recovery, like volume of oil and gas that you get out.
Right.
Okay. Cool. So where is the Mowry Shale located and why is it largely undeveloped to date? And there is some development, but there's a lot more potential than there is development. Is that fair?
That's fair to say.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fair to say. So the Mowry Shale underlies every geologic basin in Wyoming, and we talk about river basins, but a lot of times we don't talk about geologic basins. But the main basins where we're really interested in the Mowry Shale in kind of priority is first the Powder River Basin has a lot of potential for the Mowry Shale. It also underlies the Wind River Basin and the Green River Basin. And potentially there could be potential in the Bighorn Basin. Now, as you move from west to east across the state in the Wind River and Green River Basin, the Mowry Shale there is probably going to be mostly a gas play. And when we get to the Powder River Basin, it's going to be mostly an oil play.
A lot of people, there's the Powder River Basin we know can produce oil, but what about, I'm totally just asking geology questions, but why is there also coal there? Or is it just called the Powder River Basin, or is it all related, or what's going on there? Because that's where the biggest coal mines in the world are too.
Yes, so the Powder River Basin, it's a large geologic basin. It goes from the Bighorn Mountains all the way over to the eastern part of the state, almost to the state border. And then it stretches from Casper all the way north up into Montana. So it's a really large geologic basin. The coal seams are much younger than the oil and gas, so they're buried much shallower in the Powder River Basin. So those would be Paleocene, Eocene times, something in the last 30 million years. The deeper rocks, the Cretaceous rocks, and on deeper is where the oil and gas is found, and those are much older.
Cool. Okay, good to know. I feel like I just learned something. So tell us about how this project started. So phase 1 was funded by the Wyoming Energy Authority, and it launched in 2022. So tell us about the first phase, projects that were chosen, why they were chosen, and how that was done.
So the Energy Authority did fund the first phase, and how did we get that started? Why did we get that started? What had happened is federal funding for oil and gas research had dried up. The Federal Department of Energy has decided that innovation within oil and gas, it no longer needs to be funded.
At least by the federal government.
At least by the federal government.
But historically, this work has been, right?
Absolutely. So we have and of course we have a different perspective on that. Mm-hmm. But historically, this has been a large area of funding from the Department of Energy. So we have a lot of faculty members that work on oil and gas research that all of a sudden lost funding to continue their projects. So with funding from the Wyoming Energy Authority, we were able to come in and get that faculty cohort back together, get them funded so they can continue to work on their projects, but then focus them on the Mowry Shale that it would really help benefit Wyoming.
That's really important. We also are one of the universities in the country that has a petroleum engineering department. It's now called the Department of Energy and Petroleum Engineering. And this is perhaps the intention of making that change in the federal funding agencies, that they wouldn't be able to work on and fund students to be, like graduate students, to be trained on oil and gas research if there wasn't some sort of funding mechanism.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah. So it allows us to look at something, we're a land grant university. This allows us to look at oil production in the state and train students to look at that. So cool. What were the first phase of projects focused on?
So the first phase of projects, they were 2-year projects, and they were really focused kind of in 3 areas. One is characterization of the reservoir, so we could understand how that reservoir works. Another group is really working on kind of the optimization of production, so things like drilling techniques, drilling fluids, that sort of thing. And then we have a third group that is pulling all the data together to really identify sweet spots. And sweet spots are both determined from the geologic components, but also the drilling technique components, but also the economics, and really helping to identify areas in the basin that would be high priority for production.
And then recently, 13 projects were announced in phase 2, which was fully funded by the state of Wyoming. What's the focus and timeline for phase 2?
So phase 2, we broke into 2 different levels. So the first level is the projects that were originally funded, put plans in place to go to the next stage, to really bring their project up to the next stage. So we used funds to take those projects to another 3 years. And so that's bringing those projects together and really helping them move from just kind of seed funding to really getting some really nice experiments designed in the lab and starting to move to that point where those can be pilot projects out into the field. The second level, we did identify that first round, we weren't able to grasp all the different disciplines that we needed to address the larger problem. So we did bring in another 6 projects that are very fundamental first-year type of projects, fitting them into those larger 3 buckets again: characterization, optimization, and sweet spot development.
And I think that's one of the things that SER does well, and that it's so important for us to be successful, is bringing in all different departments, what we call multi-disciplinary collaboration. Talk about what departments are funded by the Mowry Project. Sure.
We've got several, a number of departments, and I'm trying to think of what they are off the top of my head. So here they are, Holly. We've got geology, geophysics, energy and petroleum engineering, civil engineering, mechanical engineering, economics, chemical engineering, School of Energy Resources, we can't forget them. I'm probably forgetting one, but every time we organize a project here at School of Energy Resources, we bring in a lot of multidisciplinary folks to cover all those different topics. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute and the Geologic Survey have both been really great at helping review all of these projects and provide guidance throughout.
Yeah, that's really important too. So they're incredible stakeholders for us. So what are the projects focused on now for phase 2?
So phase 2, it's really about, okay, what do we do in phase 1 and how can we get it to the next level? So one thing that's really interesting about the Mowry is it's geochemically complex. It has a lot of silica in it. We call it silicious as a geologist.
I love that word.
Rhymes with delicious, but it is not delicious. That makes the rock really hard. It makes it easy to frack. In between these very silicious, hard layers inside the Mowry, we get something that's a clay. It's called a bentonite. So it's the opposite. It's just this really squishy clay. And so that is kind of a nightmare when you're trying to hydraulically frack these rocks and make fractures open up so that you can get the oil and gas out. So one thing that a lot of these projects are working on is really trying to figure out the interface between that hard rock and that soft clay and what can be done to improve our hydraulic fracturing in the rock. So we call that geomechanics. We've got a really large group working on geomechanics, working on both rock strengths, but also on the ductility of the shales. We have a large group working on the drilling fluids or the fracking fluids. One thing about clays is they're very reactive. So if anybody has ever changed a baby's diaper, you know when you put it on dry, it's really light. When you take it off, it's really heavy. Well, what's in those babies' diapers is clay. It soaks up water. It loves water. So in these rocks that you have a lot of clay in there, you really have to have the right drilling fluids and hydrofrac. And Holly, you're smiling. You're trying not to laugh.
That's not the only thing in the baby diapers. That's what I was thinking.
But that is a huge challenge, and we've got a really great group working on the fluids that go down hole in these projects. Another area of focus is really focused on the depositional environments, looking at the characterization of the shales across the basin, and really trying to bring in all those different attributes we understand about the rock to do what we're calling the sweet spot analysis. And the sweet spot analysis is where we can really bring in those machine learning algorithms that we have here on campus, some really bright people that work in AI, to really help us identify what those missing variables are within the reservoir and help inform production and exploration.
Great. So do you expect there to be a phase 3? And if so, what do you think the focus and timing would be?
So yes, I expect there to be a phase 3. We have so much energy and acceleration in this program. We've got to keep it going. So phase 3 would be fiscal year 26, which starts in June of 2025. And so we're calling phase 3 the industry crosswalk. And so we hope to really get to that point where we have enough validation in the lab that we can begin to get these things out of the lab and into the field and working on some pilot projects with our industry partners.
Perfect. And to understand, I mean, the way I look at the Mowry Project, it's like we've already talked about, it's training students on Wyoming specific issues and having faculty focus on those issues, and that expertise will be around as long as those students and faculty are around. So that's an incredible outcome. In addition, if we were to have some success that maybe helped convince a producer to drill a new well, or a well was drilled in a place that made it more successful, how long would it take for the state to get paid back? So let's add up all the state funds to date. I think is $3.2 million. So $500 from the Wyoming Energy Authority, $200,000 from SCR, and $2.5 million directly from the legislature. How long would a good producing well take to pay the state back?
So that sounds like a lot of money, Holly, but we need one good producing well over 5 or 6 years, and the state makes its money back.
And so there's huge upside if we learn something that give producers more interest or more knowledge about drilling in the Mowry.
Absolutely. Yeah. If we can inform 10 wells or maybe even 100 wells, think about the upside and the payback.
Yeah. So that's a really great project, and it fits in so well with our mission. So what excites you most about the project?
The most fun for me is bringing everybody together to really work together on this problem. I think it's so fun to get everybody in the same room, throwing those ideas up onto the whiteboard. And then I'm really excited about bringing in industry so that they can help us inform that whiteboard as we start to roll these projects out.
Yeah. And so considering what's already been learned throughout the project, which is still pretty early, what do you think is the feasibility about Wyoming producers being able to continue and grow extraction of oil and gas from the Mowry Shale?
Really, really high. So there is production in the Mowry today.
Right.
And they've drilled some really nice wells lately. So if there's anything we can do to keep that going, there's a lot of high potential. You know, Holly, the other thing that's really important, I think, is this cohort of faculty that we've brought together to work on the Mowry can now pivot and work on any play within the state as we go through this.
I think the other thing that's really cool about research is we have a goal here, and it would be to train students, work with faculty, and ultimately to focus on a topic that could lead to increased production from the Mowry. But when you start down a road in research, you never actually know where you're going to end up. So one of the other cool things is we don't even know what new ideas this could spur. So it could be, it could be about the Mowry, it could be about some other reservoir, but when you have this pretty large cohort across the University of Wyoming thinking about this topic and working together, you don't know what ideas they're going to come up with. And even out of this, we're starting to think about other things we could do around on the economic side, right? And the work that's being done in the Mowry Project is actually going to be the foundation of that. So more to come on that, but I think that's like one of the coolest things about research, right, is you start with your best intentions and you end up where you end up.
Right.
But often it's like better, right? Like you end up somewhere better than you intended to go in the first place.
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
Experiments fail, you make mistakes, but you always make new discoveries too. And those new discoveries, you just don't know what they're going to be.
And I think that's really important when I talk about our research program. I think it's important that we are diverse and we're working on all different topics for Wyoming. Some of the things we work on will fail. So how do you keep your team motivated to take on these research projects knowing some of the things that we work on will never come to fruition?
In research, you have to be able to fail. If you don't fail, then you're not changing what you need to do to have the next success. So you have to be comfortable with failing. And it's not easy, but that's science, right? Not everything works. So as we go down this road, you can really, through these experiments, through an iterative process, we can really get to the point where we're making some really large discoveries.
Yeah. And I think also we have a building full of optimists. It attracts a certain kind of personality.
It does take a certain type of personality.
Otherwise, it would be too depressing to think you're working on things that may never see the light of day. But then when they do, they're transformational. So,
right.
Or they can be. So let's just have a few questions that we ask everyone to let the listeners learn a little bit more about you. So number one.
Oh, okay.
What's your favorite fishing spot?
Ooh, my favorite fishing spot.
No one ever tells me. Are you going to?
So I really love the Gray Reef.
Okay.
That float south or north of Alcova is fantastic.
It's so pretty too. Yeah. And what's your favorite place to visit in Wyoming?
My favorite place to visit. So my family has a cabin south of Mountain View, kind of on the Wyoming-Utah border, and that would be my absolute favorite place to visit in Wyoming.
What do you like about it?
Well, I grew up there.
At the cabin?
On the weekends. So when you pull up to the you pull up to the place you grew up there, and it takes you back to being 12 years old again.
Cool. And what's one thing you'd like folks to know about you?
Ooh. I'm a huge Wyoming Cowboy football fan. Go Pokes. How do I spend my free time? I love to do carpentry work. So I'll spend a Sunday afternoon in the garage working on a new cabinet or something like that. It doesn't mean I'm any good at it. Okay. But it does mean...
We're redoing a bathroom right now. So.
Well, you should see some of the work in my house.
Okay.
I don't think I'd recommend myself.
I'll get a preview. Okay, awesome. Well, Scott, thank you so much for spending time doing this podcast. Thanks for all you do for SCR and for Wyoming.
Oh, thanks, Holly.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.